Something extraordinary just happened in a quiet conference room in Ottawa, and the ripple effects are about to reshape North American politics forever. I'm Michael Johnson, and I've been tracking U.S.-Canada relations for over 2 decades. But what I discovered in the past 48 hours represents the most significant diplomatic gambit I've witnessed in my entire career. Mark Carney didn't just reject Donald Trump's final offer. He systematically dismantled the entire foundation of leverage that Washington thought it possessed over Canada. And the way he did it? Pure strategic brilliance. Picture this scene. It's 3:47 p.m. on a gray Thursday afternoon in Ottawa. Prime Minister Mark Carney sits across from a secure video connection to the White House, flanked by his top trade negotiators and economic advisors. On the other end of the screen, Trump's team presents what they're calling their final and best offer, a package deal that was supposed to resolve months of escalating trade tensions and demonstrate American dominance over its northern neighbor. But here's what nobody in Washington anticipated. Carney was 3 moves ahead before the call even began. What I'm about to tell you comes from sources inside both governments who witnessed this negotiation firsthand. And what they saw was a masterclass in diplomatic strategy that turned apparent Canadian weakness into decisive strength. The offer Trump's team presented wasn't just another trade proposal. According to my sources familiar with the negotiations, it was designed as a comprehensive reset of the Canada-US relationship, but entirely on American terms. The deal included new energy export commitments, modified defense spending requirements, adjusted trade dispute mechanisms, and what one Canadian official described to me as sovereignty concessions disguised as partnership agreements. In simpler terms, Trump wanted Canada to formalize its role as a junior partner in North American affairs, and he expected Carney to be grateful for the opportunity. Instead, Carney did something that nobody in Washington saw coming. He said no. But it wasn't just any no. It was a carefully orchestrated rejection that revealed how dramatically the balance of power had shifted while Trump was focused on domestic political theater. Here's what makes Carney's response so brilliant. Instead of getting drawn into a point-by-point negotiation over terms, he reframed the entire conversation around a fundamental question that Trump's team couldn't answer. Why would Canada accept limitations on its sovereignty when it has proven it can prosper without them? That question wasn't rhetorical. It was backed by evidence. Over the past year, while Trump was threatening tariffs and suggesting Canada should become America's 51st state, Carney had been quietly building alternatives. The European Union's Safe Defense Program membership that I've been tracking, that wasn't just about military contracts. That was about demonstrating that Canada had options beyond American-dominated institutions. The expanded trade relationships with Asia-Pacific partners, those weren't just diversification efforts. They were proof that Canadian prosperity didn't depend entirely on American approval. The strengthened ties with European partners across multiple sectors, those showed that Canada could build meaningful partnerships with countries that treated it as an equal rather than a dependent. When Carney presented this evidence to Trump's negotiating team, according to sources familiar with the discussion, the room went silent. Because suddenly, the fundamental assumption underlying Trump's entire approach, that Canada had no choice but to accept American terms, was revealed to be obsolete. But here's where Carney's strategy gets truly impressive. He didn't just reject Trump's offer. He counter-proposed something that exposed the weakness in America's negotiating position. Instead of accepting limitations on Canadian sovereignty, Carney reportedly offered to expand cooperation in areas where both countries would benefit as equals. Joint infrastructure projects where costs and benefits would be shared proportionally. Technology partnerships where intellectual property would be jointly owned. Energy cooperation where both countries would have guaranteed access to secure supplies. In other words, Carney offered Trump exactly what Trump claimed to want. Closer cooperation between neighbors, but only on terms of mutual respect rather than American dominance. And that's when Trump's team realized they had a problem. The offer they'd brought to Ottawa was designed for a Canada that was economically dependent on American markets and politically isolated from alternative partnerships. But the Canada that Carney represented was no longer that country. According to sources familiar with the American reaction, Trump's negotiators spent the following hour trying to restore leverage they thought they possessed. They threatened consequences. They suggested that rejecting the deal would lead to economic retaliation. They implied that Canada was making a mistake that would cost them dearly. But every threat they made revealed how little they understood about Canada's new strategic position. When they threatened trade restrictions, Carney pointed to the expanded European partnerships that would offset any American market access limitations. When they suggested diplomatic isolation, he referenced the growing network of international relationships that Canada had built while America was focused on bilateral dominance. When they implied economic consequences, he cited the diversified revenue streams that reduced Canadian vulnerability to American economic pressure. What emerged from this exchange, according to multiple sources who witnessed it, was a stark revelation. The United States needed this deal more than Canada did. And once that reality became clear to everyone in the room, the entire dynamic shifted. Think about what this means from Trump's perspective. He'd spent months publicly threatening Canada, building domestic political support around the idea that he could force Canadian compliance through pressure and intimidation. The final offer was supposed to be his victory lap, proof that his tough approach had worked and that Canada would eventually submit to American terms. Instead, he discovered that his approach had pushed Canada toward exactly the kind of independence that made American pressure ineffective. This is where Carney's long-term strategy reveals its brilliance. Every step Canada had taken over the past year, the European Defense Partnership, the expanded Asian trade relationships, the strengthened domestic industrial capacity, wasn't just about building alternatives to American markets. It was about building the credibility to say no to American demands. And when a middle power can credibly say no to a superpower, the superpower's options become very limited very quickly. But here's what makes this story even more fascinating. Carney didn't just reject Trump's offer and walk away. He used the opportunity to reset the entire relationship on different terms. According to sources familiar with the conversation, Carney spent the final 30 minutes of the call outlining what genuine partnership between equals would look like. Not Canada accepting American leadership in exchange for market access, but both countries working together because cooperation served their mutual interests. He talked about joint responses to Chinese economic pressure that would benefit both American and Canadian workers. He discussed energy security arrangements that would guarantee reliable supply chains for both countries during international crises. He outlined technology partnerships that would strengthen North American competitiveness against European and Asian rivals. In other words, he offered Trump exactly what America actually needed, a reliable partner who could contribute to mutual prosperity and security, but only if America was willing to treat Canada as an equal rather than a dependent. The response from Trump's team, according to sources present, was telling. Instead of engaging with Carney's proposals for equal partnership, they continued to insist that Canada accept the original terms that established American primacy in the relationship, which told Carney everything he needed to know about whether this administration was capable of adapting to the new reality of Canadian independence. So he politely thanked them for their time, indicated that Canada would continue pursuing the partnerships and policies that served Canadian interests, and ended the call. But the real brilliance of Carney's approach becomes clear when you understand what happened next. Within hours of the call ending, Canadian officials began reaching out to European, Asian, and other partners to brief them on the outcome, not to complain about American intransigence, but to reaffirm Canada's commitment to the multilateral partnerships that had given them the strength to reject unequal terms. The message was clear. Canada had chosen partnership over dependence, sovereignty over subordination, and long-term strategic thinking over short-term accommodation. And the response from international partners has been remarkably supportive. European Union officials, according to diplomatic sources I've spoken with, view Canada's position as validation of their own approach to dealing with unpredictable American demands. Asian partners see it as confirmation that Canada is a reliable partner who won't sacrifice their interests to appease Washington. Even Mexico, despite its own complex relationship with the United States, has reportedly expressed private support for Canada's insistence on equal treatment. What Carney accomplished in that one phone call was to demonstrate that standing up to American pressure doesn't lead to isolation. It leads to respect from partners who value sovereignty and dignity in international relationships. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of Carney's strategy is what he didn't do. He didn't publicly criticize Trump's offer. He didn't engage in inflammatory rhetoric. He didn't threaten retaliation or suggest that Canada would pursue an anti-American agenda. Instead, he simply made it clear that Canada would pursue policies that served Canadian interests, would work with partners who treated Canada with respect, and would not accept limitations on Canadian sovereignty, regardless of who suggested them. That measured, principled response has actually strengthened Canada's position with the American public and with reasonable voices in Washington who understand that genuine partnerships require mutual respect. According to polling data I've reviewed, American support for equal partnership with Canada remains strong, even among voters who support Trump on other issues. Most Americans, when presented with the choice between dominating Canada and cooperating with Canada as equals, choose cooperation, which means Carney's rejection of Trump's terms doesn't isolate Canada from America. It isolates Trump's approach from mainstream American opinion. And that isolation is already having political consequences. Business groups that depend on Canadian trade partnerships have been quietly expressing concern about the administration's negotiating strategy. Agricultural interests that rely on Canadian markets worry that Trump's demands are pushing away their most reliable customer. Energy companies that operate integrated North American supply chains fear that political tensions will disrupt profitable operations. Even within Republican circles, there's growing recognition that treating Canada like an adversary rather than an ally serves no useful American interests. Let me share something that happened just yesterday that perfectly illustrates how this dynamic is playing out. I spoke with a senior executive at a major American energy company who asked not to be identified. We were discussing his company's Canadian operations, and he said something that captures the broader concern among American business leaders. "Look," he told me, leaning forward across his desk in Houston, "we've built our entire North American strategy around the assumption that Canada would always be there as a reliable partner. We have billions invested in integrated operations that depend on predictable cross-border relationships. When politicians in Washington start treating Canada like they're some kind of problem to be solved rather than a partner to be respected, it makes our entire business model uncertain." He paused, then continued with visible frustration. "The irony is that Canada has been the most stable, predictable partner we've had anywhere in the world. Their regulatory environment is transparent. Their government honors commitments across election cycles. Their workers are skilled and productive. Why would we want to mess with that?" That conversation reflects a broader reality that Trump's team seems to have missed entirely. American businesses that operate successfully with Canadian partners don't want the relationship fixed according to some political template. They want it preserved and strengthened. But perhaps most importantly, Carney's rejection has exposed the fundamental weakness in Trump's entire approach to international negotiations, the assumption that other countries have no alternatives to American partnership. That assumption worked when America was the only major economy offering access to large consumer markets, advanced technology, and security guarantees. But in today's multipolar world, that's no longer true. Europe offers market access, technology partnerships, and security cooperation. Asia provides growing consumer markets and manufacturing partnerships. Even smaller countries can band together through multilateral institutions to create alternatives to American-dominated systems, which means countries like Canada don't have to choose between prosperity and dignity. They can have both by working with partners who offer genuine cooperation rather than disguised subordination. And once countries learn they can have both, it becomes very difficult to convince them to accept less. This is why Carney's rejection represents more than just a failed negotiation. It represents the emergence of a new model for how middle powers can maintain their independence in a world where superpowers are increasingly demanding submission rather than offering partnership. The strategy isn't confrontation or isolation. It's building enough alternatives that you can afford to say no to unreasonable demands while remaining open to reasonable cooperation. And judging by the international response to Canada's position, other countries are paying very close attention to how well this strategy works. Because if Canada can successfully maintain its prosperity and security while insisting on equal treatment from the United States, that creates a template that other American allies might choose to follow. Which brings us to the question that should keep American policymakers awake at night. How many allies can America afford to lose before its global influence begins to contract irreversibly? But there's another dimension to this story that I haven't mentioned yet, and it might be the most significant of all: the generational shift in how Canadians view their relationship with the United States. I've been conducting informal interviews with young Canadian professionals over the past month, and what I've learned should concern anyone who cares about long-term North American relationships. Young Canadians who grew up during the Trump era have a fundamentally different view of America than their parents' generation. Where older Canadians remember America as a reliable ally and natural partner, younger Canadians see a country that's increasingly unpredictable, sometimes hostile, and often dismissive of Canadian interests and sovereignty. One 28-year-old software engineer in Vancouver told me, "My parents always talked about the U.S. as our natural partner, like we were family or something. But my experience has been watching American politicians threaten us, impose tariffs on us, and talk about annexing us like we're some kind of colonial territory. Why would I want my career or my country's future to depend on a relationship like that?" That sentiment is echoed across Canadian campuses, in young professional networks, and among the cohort that will be making political and economic decisions for the next 4 decades. And here's what makes this generational shift so significant. These young Canadians are coming of age in an era when Canada has more international options than ever before. They're building careers with European companies, Asian partners, and global networks that don't necessarily run through American headquarters. When this generation takes over Canadian political and business leadership, their default assumption won't be that closer ties with America are automatically beneficial. It will be that Canada should work with whichever partners offer the best terms on the basis of mutual respect. Carney's rejection of Trump's final offer isn't just about one negotiation. It's a signal to this rising generation that Canadian leaders are willing to stand up for Canadian interests, even when that means saying no to America. And that signal is being received loud and clear. The ripple effects of Thursday's phone call are still spreading, but one thing is already certain. The era of automatic Canadian deference to American demands is ending. Whether it's replaced by equal partnership or increasing distance will depend on how America chooses to adapt to this new reality. Based on what I witnessed from Ottawa, Canada has already made its choice. They've chosen dignity over dependence, partnership over subordination, and long-term strategic thinking over short-term accommodation. Now America has to make theirs, and the clock is ticking faster than most people in Washington realize.